any place that will be offering you guys the space or the boardroom to offer these CPD courses? I'm not sure if I have answered you, Johan and Peter.
Okay, maybe I'll also just clarify on that aspect. I hear this word red tape, and I did mention this issue about control and quality a few times. And we also have to balance this a little bit. But where I'm from previously, red tape is actually quite a good thing, especially if the risks are too high. But if the risks are low, then we have to just think about the amount of red tape we put in. But my point here is that I think there's two processes here in terms of agreements and plans. One is a proactive process and one is a reactive process, which is looking at outcomes. And on the reactive process, yes, for sure, at that point, we should have a strong quality assurance process measuring the outcomes. But from a proactive point of view is that what we are saying in this specific instances, many organizations do not plan for their, I wouldn't say plan, but do not have agreements in place for the venues and presenters way in advance. It may not be even practical. But what we are saying is that, and we have to get the word in here, maybe reworded a little bit. And I know it is in the standard the way it is, so to revise the standard will be a bit more awkward, but maybe we can have a practice note. So, and I just wanted to state that with yourselves as the licensed body, we're expecting that a verified service provider is within your ambit. So you would also need to plan for your activities that you need validated in the year and capacity and so forth. Maybe for small organizations, it may not work out so well. So the expectation here is that service providers have, from a proactive point of view, they have some plan in place. In some cases, we are aware that only if these services, and we say specifically if they are outsourced, if you are outsourcing activities, and if you have agreements in place in advance, and we are aware of certain institutions that do that, supply that to us. If not, the minimum we are expecting from a service provider is that they supply a plan to the licensed body, because licensed bodies also need to plan for validation and so forth. So anyway, that's an expectation. When it comes to the second part of this, is that towards the latter part, which may be even a year in advance, the expectation is at the end stage that those agreements need to be in place. Now, I've heard a comment that certain agreements happen on email and so forth. The expectation is that what we do not want to have is cases that have happened before, is that venues and agreements are terminated without proper agreements in place. And then we have our registered persons that have a number of cancelled events. So all that we are asking for at this stage is that there's some sort of due diligence. Now, the other second proactive part that we are requesting is that if in the absence of these requirements, there must be a process in place for a service provider to have provisions for these things. For example, how do you acquire presenters? How do you acquire venues? And that is up to you as in your capacity as a service provider to supply that process. So that's the worst case scenario, is to have a process and at least a plan. Anyway, that is my comment from a proactive point of view. Impo, just wanted to clarify whether we've covered your point sufficiently. Okay, I'm now going to move over to Zanele, then Kevin, then Glad. And then I think if we need a break, Ivan, I'm going to hand over to you. Zanele? Zanele, you are still muted. Okay, I see. Okay, so let me move on to Kevin, and then to Glad, and then to Tabele.
Thank you very much. I've placed the sort of long version of the question in the chat box there, but really, in my opinion, the process is great that you got there, but it's really aimed at the high end and the top end of people selling CPD courses as a business, where a VA is very much a voluntary association and actually arranges ad hoc presentations 1 hour with a visiting expert in a certain field to get all of this information and register them as a service provider and to register all the other stuff that is far over the top and totally impossible. It's actually just going to kill the CPD short courses environment. Where you're selling it as a business, no problem. But where it's shorter, it's totally irrelevant. If I have an expert who's come from sea and is going to give us experience on maintenance ashore, he's not he has no VAT certificate, he's not a company, he's just an individual doing a presentation based upon his years of engineering experience and sharing it with my members. You need to put some moderation into this process. It's totally overboard. Thanks.
Okay, thank you for that, Kevin. If there's, let me move over to Glad and. Okay, so Zanela's hand is still up, but Zanela, whenever you want to come on board, let me know. So then Glad and Tabela.
Glad speaking. I just want to touch base also on the agreements with the speakers. Some of these speakers, you find they are not so keen into signing any sort of agreement because they don't want to tie themselves to one particular service provider. And then it poses a problem as to how do you say, I'm entering into this agreement. Is it exclusively to train for myself, for my organization, or, it has to be worded properly. And is that not an internal process that now ECSA is encroaching into when it comes to how the VA operates internally as to you must do this, you must do that, you must get this agreement in place, you must do this with it. I think as a service provider, you obviously have due diligence in place in terms of how you source speakers and how you source venues. And if, as you were saying, that is to protect the registered persons as to where they are going. We have put other policies in place, like a refund policy. Let's say, for instance, COVID 5th wave or 25th wave comes about, and I have to cancel with a venue. There's a refund policy in place, which we have also requested. So some processes, let them be separate from what ECSA is trying to achieve. I think you are encroaching too much in the internal processes of the service provider or the VA themselves, that we have to make a set of policies that align with ECSA, or do we make a set of policies that align with the organization internally, because it should speak to everything else we do outside of ECSA. So I don't know how the two can be married. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that. Let's take the last comment by Tabele, and then I'll Impo, if you want to respond, or I could respond to those comments. So Tabele.
Okay. Yashin, thanks very much for the opportunity. So the points I wanted to highlight, I think Kevin and Glad have touched base on those. So basically, I mean, we, for example, from the IRSE, we more of an international organization, which we operate under a broader international organization in the UK, and our activities and the way in which our members have been benefiting when it comes to presentation and information sharing and so on. We work on a voluntary basis. We don't have kind of dedicated presenters presenting a specific topic, but what we do is we ask our members to propose topics in line with our field of expertise, which is the railway signaling in South Africa. So they will prepare presentations based on projects they've worked on, based on knowledge they've acquired, and so on. And then we share that with our members, and that's how they benefit. So it was one of the tricky questions we've had to answer in terms of commitment with presenters, because we don't really work on a commitment basis. We ask members to, volunteer, as we are a voluntary organization. And another issue was that of the venues. Of course, we've had venues, and with the unfortunate situation of COVID, we've had to rethink the way we operate, and most of our activities, we moved them to online. We use Teams and other platforms for knowledge sharing and information. So we don't have dedicated specific facilities where we say, this is where we're going to do our presentations. That was also another challenge. One other challenge which we had to battle with was around the issue of Sars registration. Though we are a voluntary body, we don't really have a registration with Sars, because the intention has never always been the fact that we want to make profit or anything, but other than to improve the knowledge and expertise within a specific field. So if you can touch base on those key issues, please.
Okay, thank you for that. I think, Impo, would you like me to cover the first question? Would you like to cover it?
Cover the first question. Yeah, sure.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so I would just like to make this point clear. Maybe it's not coming across in the manner. So I'm going to try to say it in a bit more of a layman's language, if I can. And if it's still not clear, please question me on it. So firstly, the processes that are involved here for a service provider is that they expected to deliver a course or a program that at some stage will be validated by the license body. Okay, so in that process, ECSA does not stipulate exactly how an organization runs its processes. That is definitely not the case. And if that has come across that way, I would just like to remove that misconception. However, ECSA does indicate some basic requirements. So, for example, it would say it's expected that in the validation process that you have speakers who, at least one who may be registered or has specialist knowledge. Now, how you determine that will be left up to your processes. It will say that you'll have to have a refund policy in place. That refund policy, in terms of your processes, is really up to you. It will say that you would need to have a process to validate your activities. Now, in that process, it may have certain requirements. It will say, do you have, for example, some sort of database or a repository of your activities? How you store those activities is based on your own data and control processes. ECSA will ask you, do you have a process to control your data? How you do that, it's really up to you. So the requirements on our side is that you have processes in place to verify service providers and validate activities. Okay, and if you have those processes in place and if you are comfortable with them, and if they meet the requirements of the standard, and if you look at the requirements of the standard, if there are any indications that you find that any item other than I can hear one or two around the tax-related issues and those matters, and I said we will seek legal opinion on that one. But even you as a licensed body wants to ensure that individuals or service providers that you verify are in compliance, at least with legislation in some way. So I see that Peter is given a specific comment. I will go back to that comment. But I just wanted to make sure in terms of the essence here. So the essence is that you have documented processes in place, that you have agreements when it is required. I know that the way it is worded in the document at this point in time doesn't separate the two aspects of addressing the outcomes at the end and the planning aspects, and maybe we would address that separately in a practice note. So at least that becomes clearer in terms of what agreements are required and when. But in terms of the details of those agreements, would be based purely on what we indicate in the standard. But in terms of how you do it, that will be left up to your organization. Okay. So I just wanted to make those points clear. So hopefully I have clarified that. If there are aspects in your organization that you believe that you are doing it differently to the standard, for whatever reason, and it meets a certain quality requirement, we as ECSA would have to take that into consideration, look at the merits of that, and apply our minds and get back to you on that specific issue. And if that means us reviewing the standard, then we will do that, because, I mean, the standard as we see, this is our first standard that we have that has been through a process of review and so forth. And we are picking up certain issues around the standard, and we are quite flexible to incorporate and change aspects as we get more input and as we work through this process. So we're also flexible with that in terms of developing efficiencies and effectiveness as we move along. Okay, I just thought, and so we also appreciate your comments, because this also gives us insight into what we could potentially change, or the way that we approach things as we moving forward. So we also really appreciate that. Hopefully I've been able to cover that aspect. Peter, you did mention there was something on the slide that you would like me to address. Could you refer to that, and maybe I would address that specific point?
No, I've just commented that what you have now explained is a very simplification of the prescriptive details asked for in the list on the slides. If we applied what you're saying now, we would have no problem applying it. But okay, it's very different to those list of requirements on the slides. Thanks. Okay, thank you. Could you,
Ivan, could you just flip on that slide? I just wanted to just ensure that which requirements those are. Can you just put the slide back on? I just want to make sure that I've addressed all these points. So Peter, just to illustrate, if you could indicate to me, because maybe I maybe want to elaborate on more detail on our end. Could you elaborate on this slide which aspects you find that would require detail that may not be that simplistic? And maybe I should elaborate on that just to clarify on those points.
Most of the information you require there is reasonable, but certainly item 5, the agreements in place. You've heard it from various speakers. We are voluntary associations, and we're not professionals in the field, but the quality of training is good. And this is going on non-essential things rather than concentrating on getting good course structure. I think the rest of the things, there's no problem with contingency plans for refunds and that, but a broad outline of the program of activities for the forthcoming year. As you've heard, a lot of the activities are planned at relatively short notice. We're planning a conference at the end of the year. we haven't finalized a date. We don't have a venue yet, but we're working at it. Yes, we do keep records and that, and yes, when you come with the auditing, that will be good. But I think being too prescriptive and setting too much red tape is going to put voluntary associations off from doing training, and then where will you be? How are you going to get your CPD points if we decide that it's just too cumbersome to go forward with it? Thanks.
Okay, so it looks like there are 2 points. So number 5, I think I may have covered in some detail to say that if it's planning activities, it would just be your planning related matters, and those agreements would only be in place if you have agreements in place. Otherwise, you just won't have them. Now, let me come to this yearly plan, because this was a contentious issue, and we also had debates around this on inputs that we've also received from certain VAs and so forth. Our expectation here, okay, Ivan, I think you, I cannot see the screen with the exact wording. Thank you. The arrangement here in terms of the broad outline of the, okay, so sorry, I think number 5 we have covered because I think most of the other items are quite straightforward. Item number 7. The expectation here is that this would be a planning document that would come to you as a licensed body from your service provider. Okay. Of activities they have planned. I mean, there's activities they would not have planned, but at least they'll give you an indication. So our expectation here is not that they have a plan. Okay, well, they don't submit anything. At least they submit to you something that they have some indication that is going to happen. Now, remember, this will come to a licensed body. Now, the reason that we've put this in is that you as a licensed body would look at this plan, and if this requirement was not here, that would mean that a service provider, if they want to submit a plan, they could. If they don't want to, they don't have to. But this gives you an option as the licensed body to indicate to the service provider, we are aware that you have certain activities planned. Can you just roughly indicate when they would be coming through? So then you as a licensed body can also plan for validation and whatever things you need to plan for. So this is just a broad outline of activities that are expected from a service provider for them to plan for that year. We do acknowledge that you as a licensed body will have the prerogative to say, yes, I'm happy with this. I also acknowledge you as a service provider, and the arrangements I have with you is that you offer your programs on a very ad hoc basis, and it's done in a very specific way. So you're only aware every 3 months. So can you just indicate to me without much detail that roughly I'm expecting 15 activities in the next month or whatever it is. So at least you have some essence of the type of activities that would be coming to you. You are not necessarily checking or validating any of those activities. It's just a plan for you to give you an indication of how to plan your validation activities. So hopefully, and that plan of program of activities is under the discretion of the licensed body, which would be yourselves in this instance. And it would be ECSA in the instance where you applied for verification. But remember, when you apply for verification to ECSA, all you are doing is that ECSA doesn't validate your activities. You validate your activities. And I hope as a licensed body, unless you have specific requirements and most things are ad hoc, that, as a verified service provider, that you may also have certain activities that you've planned. And we just thought that it may be good practice if a licensed body will be doing this for their service providers to ask them for this information, that it would be something fair that they should submit as a service provider as well. But it's just a broad outline of what they believe will be planned. Those activities will change. So for example, I think it was you, Peter, who mentioned that you have an activity that's coming up in October or November, and it's an international conference, and you don't have the details of that conference, maybe you do, And then you would indicate there's a conference activity. It's going to be roughly 3 to 5 days. It will be happening wherever it is or wherever you think it is. And that would be your broad outline. And if you have some details to that, you can put it forth. So we haven't prescribed those details either. And if you as a licensed body would want to prescribe details to your service providers, that is within your ambit. And I know that there are certain organizations that have detailed processes around how they approve their service providers. And we just thought of putting that clause in, which is clause number 7, so that you have that option to request that information and it is on your radar. So hopefully I've clarified on that point. So with that, I would now want to move on. I see Zanera's hand is up, Johan's hand is up, and I think we may have exhausted this area. I also note your comments. So any aspects that we may not have concluded in this session, which is really a training session, we would try to address that in an engagement session. So Zanere and then Johan, and then I think we'll have to move on to the next section.
Okay, thanks, Yashin. Just a quick one. While we're going through the requirements that needs to be fulfilled for when applying for verification, there's something that I have picked up. I've looked at the revised Ecpd7 form, and when you look at the checklist, point 10 is evidence of being an ECSA CPD licensed body in good standing, and yet at the top we are actually giving an instruction that they must please complete and return to the appropriate ECSA CPD licensed body. So I was thinking, if we're going to be actually sending the forms to the training companies, if they wish to become an ECSA service provider, can't we remove point 10 so that they don't get confused?
Okay, point noted. I think we will look at that form and see if we can make a revision around that.
Thank you.
Johan, I see your hand is up, and then...
Yes, just a quick one. So the Ecpd7 form has got a dual purpose. The one is the licensing bodies applying to be a service provider to ECSA, but yet that same form also gets used for training or service providers to become a service provider validated by the licensing body. Is that correct?
Okay, sorry, say that again. I missed you on that one.
Okay,
so even after doing this training and even going through this, those three terminologies, and I still confused.
Okay.
But okay, if you can ask that again, and Karina, maybe when it comes to the forms, if you can respond to this question. So go ahead, Johan.
Okay, so the Ecpd7 form. Now that is a form that you apply to become a service provider. It's got a dual purpose. Number one, you complete that to submit it to ECSA to become a service provider. But that same form also gets used by training providers to apply to voluntary associations or licensing bodies to be recognized or to become a service provider. Am I correct in that statement?
Okay, Karina, have you heard that question?
Yes, I have. Johan, you're actually correct. You're 100% correct. But the voluntary association can, or the licensing body can develop their own form as well. They don't need to use that form. So if they prefer to use that form, they're allowed to, but they all can also develop their own form.
That is the best news I've heard today, because the system that we're building, we were building it around this service provider form for Ecpd, and we had a look at it, and that's why I said there's a catch-22 in it. The last point on that checklist of documentation says that you need to submit a document that you've been approved, but you can't because you haven't been approved yet. So, and if that's the case, and we can get clarification or confirmation of that, then thank you. It will make my life so much better.
Okay, so that's great. So Tabele, before I give you the floor, just to to answer your question, is that we did understand that there's going to be a conflict of interest in some way, but we've taken the decision that if you are a licensed body and if you are a service provider, is that yes, you will validate your own activities. ECSA will not, well, ECSA is not going to validate those activities. So that, and this is why we do indicate if you are a licensed body and you are a service provider, and even though we do understand there may be some related conflict of interest, or some may call it even a convergence of interest, is that the onus is really upon you to ensure that you have some related independence in your structures and in your processes, so that when you do the validation, that there's some sense of independency as best as you can have it. We do not dictate in terms of how that happens, and we've left it up to you as the licensed body in terms of how you validate your own activities. And this is why also we've added in those additional provisions that you've seen there, and I know that two of them are quite maybe difficult, which is point number 5 and 7. We've added in those additional details in there to ensure that at least you can meet those specific requirements. So Tebele, I'm going to give you now the floor, and if I haven't answered those questions, you can raise them now, and then we'd close this part of the session and we'd move on to the next question.
Yeah, Yashin, thanks. I think you've answered it partly, and that's the best news I've had of the day also. But a quick follow-up is, if you are a licensed body, approved licensed body, I'm battling to understand, and you are required to validate your own CPD activities. I'm battling to understand, why do you then need to apply again as a service provider?
Okay, so we were caught in a catch-22 situation in this regard, and we thought that the only thing that you would require to do, because we really wanted you to validate your own activities, so we said, okay, the only independence we would remove from that process is that you cannot approve yourself as your own service provider.
Okay.
So as a result, this is one of the rationales we use, that to say, okay, if that's the case, then if you're a VA and you want to be a service provider, not all VAs want to be a service provider. If you're a VA and want to be a service provider, or if you're a higher education institution and want to be a service provider, then you would apply to ECSA, and ECSA would endorse you as a service provider. But once that happens, you validate your own activities.
Fair point. Thank you, Yashin.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, I think I must move on. So Ivan, back over to you, because I'm not sure how we're doing for time.
Yeah, I think at this stage, I'm not sure if I think I am sharing. Mpho, would you like me to continue and finish this section, or?
You can continue, Ivan. I'll take over from item number 11.
Okay. All right. Quite a bit has been covered around the criteria, which some of the items are fairly explicit, but just for completeness, let me just run through them again. The broad outline around what is by means of activities for the year, database of those very same activities, and as part of the QMS, clear document control procedure and systems even in place, and the enrollment of and registration of participants that speak to the earlier point around attendance, delegate attendance management. Item number 11, monitoring and recording attendance for the duration of activity, which is linked again to the number of hours as well as credits that accumulate per CPD activity. Process for certification, Do you issue attendance records, and what do those attendance records or certificates look like? Do you evaluate your activities for improved quality assurance? And how do you obtain feedback to measure the quality assurance of that particular, the quality of that particular activities? And again, all of this directed at ensuring that that the registered person receives quality activities from service providers. There was reference earlier to ensuring that there is a refund policy. How do you have an explicit policy or procedure for refunding fees and any other related costs that this registered person may have incurred? And here we are referring to sections 11.1 to 6 of the standard that provides guidelines in this regard. And always that costs that are associated with offering CPD activities, that they must be reasonable and justifiable. And the licensed body to whom ECSA has delegated this the verification of CPD service providers can request additional information during the verification of any CPD service provider applicant. How does the verification process work? Just detailed. There's an application by the prospective CPD service provider to the licensed body using Ecpd7 Form, as well as the inclusion or attachment of all required documents. Now, the outcomes of that application process could be that the applicant is verified. They could be verified with specific recommendations from the licensed body, or it could be declined or not approved. The applicant would receive a certificate as a service provider with a unique number, which the service provider would obviously use for its own marketing activities, or inclusion in the website if it uses the website for marketing purposes. And again, the stated timeline of a maximum of 30 calendar days for the outcome of that application process to be communicated to the applicant. And if the application is rejected, a record must be kept of that application. And the record would obviously need to deal with future applications from that particular service provider. How is the verification process reviewed and monitored? How do we review and monitor? Again, the period, as asked earlier, is service providers are verified for a period of 3 years. And the licensed body, as a delegated body from ECSA, has the right to also conduct more than one review during the 3-year period. And the licensed body would use the CPD standard during the review process. And pretty much similar to what would apply to recognition of licensed bodies. If false information is submitted, the licensed body can immediately remove the service provider's verification. And if there are changes on the part of the CPD providers in terms of no longer meeting the requirements for verification, the licensed body must outline in writing the deficiencies to the CPD service provider and indicate what must be corrected or around the deficiencies that would have been found. If the service provider does not resolve those deficiencies in the stipulated timelines, the status of that licensed body can be revoked or terminated by the licensed body. And again, the termination or the revocation would be communicated in writing to the CPD service provider concerned. And again, the licensed body would need to communicate with ECSA of such removal or termination of a CPD provider within 10 working days of that having been communicated to the service provider. Any changes, again, as applied to licensed bodies, any changes must be communicated by the service provider to the licensed body. And reference would need to be made to that original application by the service provider, and that changes must be communicated to the licensed body within 21 days of the date of change. And again, if there are any changes from ECSA side, specifically around the standard, on requirements for verification, ECSA would communicate those to obviously to licensed bodies. In turn, licensed bodies would need to communicate those amendments or changes to requirements to the CPD service providers. And typically the process would be as per licensed body, as for recognized licensed bodies, the input would be sought from service providers and other stakeholders, and any changes, all those comments and recommendations for changes would be incorporated and communicated to all stakeholders. Appeal process. If a CPD provider has not met the verification requirements as stipulated in the standard, the licensed body would obviously decline the application and notify the applicant CPD provider in writing. If the CPD service provider as an applicant is not satisfied with the outcome of the application, there's an appeal process that is communicated. They would appeal to that relevant licensed body where the application was lodged. The licensed body will then in turn submit the appeal to ECSA or another licensed body for independent consideration. So this is quite important, that in this case, the licensed body to whom the appeal is lodged may choose to either bring it to ECSA or another recognized licensed body for consideration. The licensed body or ECSA that reviews the appeal will obviously follow the guidelines in the CPD standard to consider the appeal and adjudicate on the matter. I'm not sure if there are any questions up until this point. I think we may have covered quite a bit, and they may relate to the specific processes that I've just covered. Before I hand over to Mpho.
I think let's hand it over to Mpho at this point. I think just from a time perspective, and we can take questions
after.
Yeah, because I think the validation aspect is quite important. Thank you.
Ivan, can you share the presentation for me? Good afternoon once again, colleagues. I'm going to be taking you through the validation process of the CPD activities. This process constitutes level 3 of ECSA CPD standards. This function is carried out by CPD licensed bodies. Like Yashin has said, if you are a verified service provider, you can, okay, the presentation is gone. You can also validate your own CPD activities. This process recognizes CPD service provider category CPD activities 1, which is required to attain the CPD credits needed to renew registration professional and specified the categories. The service providers are accountable for all validated CPD activities delivered under its unique number, which must be displayed at all marketing material for the activity, the website confirmation of attendance, and certificate issued to the attendees. Next slide, please. A specified validated activity's unique validation number is not transferable to a third party. I think this is something that was also covered in the previous chapter. I think it was chapter 11. A validation must be obtained prior hosting such an activity. This type of activity, which are, I think, category 1, are structured development educational activities. This may include conferences, congresses, large group workshops, lectures, seminars, refresher groups, colloquiums, e-learning, relevant additional and completed accredited qualification at benchmark level or above, complicated postgraduate qualifications. Next slide, please. So this category is a developmental activities which has got a minimum of 5 credits per 5 years cycle. These are the categories that can be validated. But we also have category 2, which is work-based activities, category 3, which is individual activities. So category 2 and category 3 cannot be validated by a licensed body. Next slide, please. This process ensures that activities meet the minimum requirements for CPD credits, which include full details of a CPD activity, the title, the duration, the location, even if it's an online kind of an activity, model of delivery, scope, learning outcomes, and type of activity, with the application form completed and sent back to the licensed body. So this application form must be filled in full with all those details. The engineering registration category and discipline for the target audience must also be part of the information that must be provided on the application form. The details of a presenter, which must include the title, the name, the contact details, detailed CV with a copy of ID and ECSA professional registration number if it is applicable. The marketing of these activities and the validation process. The service provider is responsible for the marketing of these activities. If they are to use the ECSA logo, they must ensure that it complies with the ECSA requirements. This process will take or has to be conducted or concluded in 30 days. The process is subject to submission of all requirement documentation for the type of evaluation required. So this is the process flow of how these CPD activities are validated. This process relies on... Can you go back to the previous slide? The slide before this one. The process relies on the CPD license body who employs specialized reviewers. I think this will eliminate the element. I think there was a question that was asked by Debele about a verified service provider validating its own CPD activities. So this will eliminate the element of, I think, conflict of interest. I think it was touched by Yashin. At least one must be registered in either the professional or specified categories required for the level of the activity. You can go to the next slide. Can you go back to the process flow? So this is how the process goes. The CPD validation process, it will be triggered by a service provider who is applying for the validation of an activity. The license body will then receive the application. Then the license body will submit the activity information documentation to the reviewers, those specialized reviewers. The reviewer will then review the activities for Category 1 CPD credits. There are three outcomes in that review process. It can either be full validation, it can either be restricted validation or rejected validation. In cases where a validation is rejected, the license body has to inform the service provider and update the information on its database and also inform ECSA. In cases where there is restricted validation, the license body will have to inform the CPD service provider of the corrective actions required. Then the service provider will have to institute the corrective actions and forward the license body for confirmation. Then the process or the application will be reviewed again. In cases where there's full validation, the license body will then update the database and it will inform ECSA of the outcome and the process will end. Next slide, please. I have already taken you through this process. So this is just a breakdown of the process flow that I have already taken you through, where the specialized reviewer conducts an assessment on the CPD activity based on the submission and requirements for the service provider. But another point that you need to take home is that the service provider cannot apply to another CPD license body in cases where an activity was rejected. The license body must also provide the list of all rejected activities to the Engineering Council of South Africa. The last bullet I have already taken you through, where I shared with you the three outcomes of the process. Then the review and monitoring and record keeping. The review and monitoring is valid for a period of 3 years. If there are any changes within that period to the information that was presented, the application must be submitted to the relevant CPD license body so that they can do the revalidation. The license bodies and CPD service providers must ensure that they keep all records of all of the applications. They must also have an adequate organization policy on document and data control. The records must include date of application and indicate approval pending or rejection. The records must also include details of the outcome and, if applicable, the validation number and renewal date. I will stop there for questions before going to chapter or item number 12.
I think Johan's.
Yeah, just a quick one. Actually, there's two. The first one, when you appoint reviewers, in some cases they might not be professionally registered. They might be an expert in finance, and they know what kind of material needs to be and on what level it needs to take place. So I don't know if you're going to hold people to that one. That's the first comment that I have. The second one the CPD validation of events varies. Some of them are conferences and they're only validated for that period, whereas a project management course is validated for 3 years. A webinar could or could not be, or it could be 1 year, pertaining to, say, for instance, contract documents. So it's not reflected here. I just assume that everybody knows that, correct?
Impo, if you want to take that, you can.
Yes, I didn't get the first question. I think the line was not that clear, unless if you did manage to.
Okay. So on the first question, the question was, if, for example, you do a finance course or a project management course, I suspect, and because the current requirement is that you need to have at least one registered person. So, Johan, I'm not sure if you want us to elaborate on that or.
No, that's fine. But if there's not a PR Range or PR Tech or one of those available to do the validation, but you've got an expert in finance that can validate the event for you, then my question is, surely that should be fine. You shouldn't be forced to have a professionally registered person also looking at it, right?
Yeah. Okay. For this one, I would probably have to take this back to the committee, but I can just tell you what the current stance is. Even if it's a finance course or a project management course, and I suspect it's related to engineering, and it depends what that means to you. But if it's applied in the engineering space and so forth, our current requirement is that you need a registered person to sign it off now. I do not want to dictate in terms of how you do that as a VA, because you may have an internal process that you are comfortable that as a representative of the engineering profession, that an individual outside your profession has delivered on an aspect that you believe, based on the information you have in front of you, are comfortable with. Now, we expect that the person who's passing that judgment is a registered person, because that individual will carry that accountability. So at this point in time, whoever's doing the validation, and if you want to change that, I mean, we'll have to just discuss this internally. If you want to change that process slightly, we may just think about it. But at this point in time is that the accountable person for validation that you appoint would be your reviewer. So if you appoint, let's just say, a finance specialist reviewer, whatever that is, we are saying that, and even if the ECSA registered person passes judgment that this is correct, that what we've done, the accountability that we are responsible for is on the ECSA registered person. So we are hoping that the ECSA registered person would be the one who takes accountability for that validation. So the current process is that whoever is the ECSA responsible person who's accountable for that validation would sign off. Whether that happens internally within your organization, because you've gone through some review process and you've appointed a specialist outside and the ECSA person signs it off, is really up to you. But the current expectation in terms of the standard is that an ECSA registered person signs off at some point in this validation process.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
So on the second question, Impo, I'm not sure if you want to take that. I couldn't remember that.
I think the second question was about the validation period. You can correct me if I'm wrong.
Yes, because look, the validation period varies. If it's a conference, it's only for that time that the conference is taking place, because you can't validate that for 3 years, because that conference changes. Next year's different speakers, different programs, different everything. And if you've got a webinar, as an example, that you know legislation is going to change in a year, then you validate that one for a year. If it's a project management course that sort of runs 3 years and it doesn't really change, then that is fine. I just want to make sure that that's built in somewhere, because I haven't seen it. I've only seen that the validation period is 3 years, and
Yes.
I just wanted some clarity on that.
Okay, so the validation period that we specified is the maximum validation period. And if courses are substantially changed in any ways or programs, we expect new validation numbers. However, I see Corina's hand is up. So Corina, if you want to respond to that.
Yashin, you're actually right. That is the maximum time period that the activity can be validated for. It can be validated for less of a period, or if it's in a conference, only for the particular day that the conference took place. So you're 100% right. Thanks.
Thanks, Karina. Got it.
Okay, back over to you, Mpo. Mpo, I see that there's one more question. Something around why do we need an ID copy of the presenter? If you could take that one.
Thanks, Yashin. Okay, as part of the requirements, I think that is something that we still need to, because if you can recall, in some of our audits, I think we had issues with that part, where I think a lot of license bodies, unless if you wanna maybe assist me with that question, Yashin.
Okay, that's fine. So yeah, okay, so this became a contentious issue when it came to the appointment of individuals who do not have. Okay, let me put it this way: who do not have South African ID documents. So the expectation here is that a service provider would appoint an individual through some agreement, and that agreement that you have with the presenter would have to have some terms and conditions. And I do acknowledge that there was an indication that maybe some presenters do not want to be sole providers, etc. But I think that needs to be part of an agreement that you have. When I say you, I'm talking about that the service provider has with a presenter. Now, in terms of that, the expectation is that any individual who presents on your behalf, because I'm saying that on your behalf when you are a service provider, that you're expected to have appropriate identification documents that you would request from that presenter, that you would keep on record. And this is a general norm in any event for any service provision of any activity, irrespective of courses. It goes beyond professions, so that you have some identification that you keep of an individual who does service provision for you. So that's an expectation, and if that individual has an ECSA registration number, you're also expected to keep that. I hope I was able to cover your question around that. Now, there is another aspect I was going to raise. Okay, I just want to conclude on the second aspect. I see that, anyway, Tom also raised this, and this is something that we have also raised internally in terms of the POPI Act, and in terms of what informations you can share with ECSA and what you cannot. Or let me put it this way, in terms of what information you can share that is given to you outside of your organization, in terms of the agreement you've signed with that individual. Because normally it's expected, also in terms of the POPI Act, that whatever information that is given to you as an organization or individual, that in terms of that agreement, there must be clauses in place in terms of what is shared and what is not, and the individual who shared that information must agree to it. Now, in terms of that, we are in discussions with ECSA Legal around this, but also we are also looking at and leveraging off the processes we have for other environments in ECSA, more specifically around accreditation committees and so forth. So we will have to get back to you in terms of that. But in terms of what you expected to do, in terms of your internal requirements, now how are we going to monitor this? We'll have to deal with this from a legal standpoint. Is that the expectation is that in terms of your processes, you're expected to have identification documents that you've retrieved from your service providers, as would have been the norm for any service provision process.
Thank you, Yashin. To that first point, once again, I think you're aiming at high-level, formal, contracted, paid-for courses. As a VA, we often have, at a monthly meeting, we have a presenter who's a visiting engineer from MTU, and he comes and tells us about the latest developments in engines. He's going to talk to us for an hour after the meeting. What you're describing here seems to be well over the top for trying to document. He's not a service provider, he's just a visiting engineer who's now delivering a speech. So I just don't get the context of it. It seems over the top. Sorry. Thank you.
Okay, so I mean, at this point in time, Tom, I think you've also made a few comments there. I'm not sure if you want to just speak to that process. I see from a SIC perspective, and then I will also give a response regarding if you have these ad hoc presenters that do come and would want to do a presentation. But maybe on that point, is it something planned or is it unplanned as a matter of interest?
We take them when we can get them. If you can get a good person, then you arrange it at the meeting. Sometimes it's difficult. It's not necessarily planned. You plan to have a meeting a month, but who it's going to be is going to be a fight. You see who you can source. So, yeah, it's not broadly
noted.
Planned, not specifics.
Noted. Tom, I see that you've made a few comments. If you want to...
Yeah, Shane, I think ultimately what ECSA needs to do is make sure that whatever processes and procedures the VAs use are defendable. So the reason I made reference to the individual presenter was we have historically, and I've been doing validations in SASI as chair of E&T panel and now obviously as head of training for 25 years. What we found was that external providers, and I shan't name them, would apply for validation with the credentials of the presenter, very, very appropriate, right background, right knowledge, right everything, get the validation number, and then promptly go and substitute the presenter, which I think is partly what you were alluding to in terms of, you get complaints then that we assumed X would present and Y actually did, and they know nothing about the topic. So we've deliberately made sure that when we validate, the service provider and our own subdivisions, branches or technical divisions are very clearly told that that validation is only valid if the person whose credentials were presented as part of the application continues to present. If they change the presenter, and that does happen, it requires a complete new application, which is a fast-tracked application because the content doesn't change, for us to check against one of the ECSA criteria that the presenter still meets the necessary skill set in order to present that training. So I think a lot of what we are discussing is administrative, internal activities, which I agree, for ECSA to start trying to regulate how we process our procedures. But I do think ECSA has every right to ask us to document what we do and how we do it in order that you can confidently defend your VAs as being accrediting agents on your behalf.
Thank you so much for that, Tom. I couldn't have said it better. Thank you for that. So I think we are running out of time. So I think if we can just go through the last part of the presentation, Umpo. And then I'll take Peter's question maybe after that.
Thanks, Chair. The last part of the presentation will be the auditing and the review process, where the CPD license of a recognized either VA or higher educational institution is valid for 3 years, after which it must be renewed. The CPD committee, which is a high impact committee of ECSA Council, has the authority to audit these licensed bodies. The process consists of verifying that the CPD licensed bodies complies with criteria for appointment as licensed bodies as stipulated in CPD standard and the original application form, which is Ecpd 8. This process is similar to ECSA's program of accreditation of universities. Next slide, please. The ECSA CPD committee decides, in consultation with the licensed bodies and ECSA administration, on the appropriate auditing method. This audit can be conducted under 3 modalities. It can be done face-to-face, it can be an online audit, or it can be a combination of either face-to-face or online. There are factors that are considered, which include availability of documentation, type of auditing process, cost, permissible logistics that are required for the process. Next. The licensed body will be notified or are notified at least 3 months before the regular audit, which is done every 3 years. In the case of an interim audit, which can be triggered by material change or a complaint from a registered person, the audit will be scheduled as soon as possible from the time the CPD committee has tabled the matter. The licensed body being audited is responsible for preparing the required documents and making it available to the ECSA auditors. And these requirements are sent to the licensed body so that they can be prepared. Next slide, please. The auditing requirements are as follows. For licensed bodies, the key requirements is section 9.2, where we also require the records of verified and rejected CPD service providers. And this is done once per recognized cycle. The auditing of service providers, the key requirements, there is section 10.1, where we also require the records of verified and rejected CPD activities, where we look at the 5% of what they have verified, and this is done once. The CPD activities, the key requirements, there is section 11.1, where we also require the attendance register, the evaluation forms, the material and the instructor, and issued certificates, where the sample percentage there is 5%, which is also done once. Next slide, please. Responsibility for reporting. There is a report that will be generated or that is generated at the end of each audit process. The audit team leader is the one that is responsible for the quality of this report. This report will clearly distinguish between matters that affect auditing decisions and matters identified for improvements, which are going to be shared. Matters that affect the auditing decisions are generally findings, whereas matters identified for improvements are concerned. This report should assist the CPD committee to decide whether to renew the license, whether we grant provisional renewal with conditions to be addressed in a specified period, or we withdraw the license. And then these are the latest CPD forms, which are available on the website, and they also have the published date on the right of the screen. I think this is the last slide. I will pause and stop there for questions and comments. Thanks, Chair.
Okay, thank you. I see. Okay, so I'll take a comment from Peter, and then I see there's something that says UNCEL, and then I will respond to the question on IDs, and so we can close that one.
Okay, thanks, Chair. UNCEL is answered, is coming in. But
okay. I was not sure whether that's an acronym, you know.
Sure, no problem. So tell me, employer, like, how are we dealing with these companies that they just want their in-house material, training material to be validated? They're running powerful training programs in their companies and all that. So how do we handle this? Do they need to be applied to be a CPD service providers or what?
Could you probably repeat the question, Umpo? Did you get that?
Yes, I did get the answer. Yeah, the answer is yes. They just have to go through the process for you to verify their CPD activities. As long as the courses that they are offering are going to have CPD points, they need to go through the process.
So you mean even like now, I just need only a 5-day training program to be validated, say turbine, for instance, training. That organization must apply CPD provider to ECSA also. That's what he's saying. Doesn't matter one CPD credit, doesn't matter 0.5, it doesn't matter. Because we've got the organizations that are coming to us and look, I mean, to tell ESCO, maybe just give me only one course, and then I tell you that you must register as a CPD service provider, while it's not selling it's not doing a training, just an in-house training.
Okay, Umpo, I see Corina's hand is up, so I'm not sure. Corina, did you want to respond to that?
Yes, I'm going to try to respond to that. Uncle, what needs to happen is the ESCOM, for example, the ESCOM would need to apply to a licensing body. And if they're going to apply to you to get the activities validated, they need to also apply to CIMIC or whoever you are to get their verification. So if they receive the verification once, that verification will stand for a period of 3 years before they need to apply again for verification. But then they can only apply after the verification, and they have 100 of the activities that needs to be validated, they apply to you. Does it answer your question?
Not really. My worry is, I know that the current what we're doing, we are validating like the way you are saying, it's answering my answer, but the way I see it now, it's like they are applying to me like now. They don't have there's a form that you develop has got a CPD service provider that when we do send it back to you. So I get confused. There's one that must be sent by VA, one must be for VA, one must be for the service CPD service provider, of which I'll be validating them. But I don't have their number on the other end because they didn't apply as a service provider. How do we deal with this one? Because if I look at the requirements with both two forms that we are signing off now.
Okay, I think we are almost out for time. I think I will take that question. Let me just get all the other questions, and then we would I'll address all of them together. So should I take? Is it Marwale, and then Peter? I see Peter's hand is still up. Marwale, is it Marwale?
Yes, it's Marwale. Am I audible?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. It's just a comment. I'm not a service provider, but I am a member of a VA. So I think this just cost us so much red tape that it's going to be a deterrent for even future members, whoever will be trying to apply maybe to be a registered member of ECSA. So this is just gonna cause more headache for them, because how as an individual now I must go and verify with whoever who provides those the CPDs, if it's accredited by ECSA or it's so it's just gonna be more red tape, and it's going to be a deterrent for aspiring members. That's my comment.
Okay. Noted,